It's always awkward starting these because we talk a little bit beforehand, but this is Sean O'Brien. I'd like to welcome you on board. Thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate your time. I know you're busy, so it's really appreciated. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell my audience who you are?
Sure. So I am Sean O'Brien. I'm a lecturer at Yale Law School. We do cybersecurity, which is a very fun class, and we can talk about a little bit. I also founded Yale Privacy Lab, which does digital self-defense and some other very cool stuff. I run something called PrivacySafe, where we're now focusing on remote education and IoT for healthcare. All of that's on free and open source software. And yeah, I do some other cool things, but basically I always try to keep my work on the edge of privacy and technology.
Awesome. And I'm going through your resume and I see that you're doing most of these things all at the same time. So how do you handle that all?
Well, I think you know as well, working on so much stuff. I try my best to juggle things. What else can I say? I like to joke that I don't sleep very well, but I've been doing that a lot more often with COVID here. So.
Sleeping well during COVID or not well?
Sleeping well. I might be having nightmares about the way the world's shaping up, but that's about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess the lockdown for me is kind of a blessing and the curse. It's a curse because it's just so boring, but the blessing is I can focus just completely on work, and that's the one perk, I guess.
Yeah, I've heard from people who are working on projects or workaholics even that it's that thing of diving into the work rather than looking around and seeing what's going on, and that's happening to me a little bit too, I think so.
Yeah, it's important to just go outside and walk around one here and then. So I have a few questions, I guess 10 in total just by chance, and I don't want to make this feel too scripted, so I don't want to just ask a question and you answer. So I like these to be somewhat discussion-based, but at the same time, I think the questions keep the flow going. So let's just start talking about privacy. And when I read off, you're going to see I'm reading to the left here. Don't mind me. Privacy, how'd you get into it? I think that everyone has kind of a unique story where they start falling in love with their passion for privacy. So what's your story behind all that?
Sure. So I think in a very real sense, when I first got started using the internet, I started thinking about these things. I think for me, privacy is about autonomy and it's about identity, really, in a lot of senses. So I grew up in the 90s. By the late 90s, what was I, 14 or 15 years old? I was making crappy websites on GeoCities, etc. And part of that experience of putting yourself out there on the internet, making part of your life public or the things you want people to see public, makes you think a little bit about identity. And, I had a lot of fun, wacky websites where, I would take on a character or something like that. So the idea of being able to run something behind the scenes and be a different person than you're showing the rest of the world already had me thinking about identity. I don't think I really got into thinking about, the perils of technology and the things that we should really be worried about as far as technology's ability to identify and categorize and control us until college. So I don't know if I have a specific story, but I got into the tech liberation movement or whatever people want to call it with a lot of other people in the mid-2000s, got very interested in decentralized technology, got very interested in what social media could do to us. So I was a very early adopter of Facebook, for example. It came through the Northeast from Harvard and universities like that, and then was offered, at my university at the time, which was UConn. And was very gung-ho about it. This is very cool, it's a community, because I always have this community idea that the internet has that power. But then when I started learning what was going on behind the scenes, I think that's when I really got into the worry part of the flip side of the coin. So yeah, I ran a decentralized social node, something called Friendica, which some folks may be aware of at the time. I called that Fooj Book. It was the anti-Facebook. Tried to get my friends into it, et cetera, et cetera. And I was just always working on sort of wacky projects like that. The big catalyzing moment, I think, for me and for a lot of people, where we sort of got more serious, was the Edward Snowden disclosures in 2013. And all of a sudden, I had people say to me, "Oh, that stuff you were talking about, that stuff that I was maybe being annoying at parties talking about."
You're not actually crazy.
Suddenly that mattered, right? And activist groups were starting to get it. You had Occupy and stuff like that. Shortly before that, and then through the Snowden disclosures, and so I started teaching classes about it. I started showing people ways they could be more private and secure online, potentially anonymous where I could, and yeah, that's basically how I got into it.
That's sweet. And so you were an early adopter of Facebook. You said that you kind of already started thinking about the privacy implications of Facebook. Was this kind of before Facebook was even known for having bad privacy? Because I remember when I got my first iPhone, I got the iPhone 4. I don't think I ever heard about privacy before. But also I was in middle school. So I don't know if that's something that just wasn't talked about, or if it's because I was in middle school, because I never even heard about Edward Snowden until like early high school, way past after the actual revelations. So I guess some insight there from someone who actually remembers.
So when you're a web developer, right, and like I said, I was doing crappy websites, but I quickly transitioned into doing real web work, and I did that throughout college and into graduate school. When you're a web developer, the amount of information you can get from a user, right? And you start to become aware of what you can do with that information. And I remember, for example, one of the things we used to talk about with JavaScript, we'd be like, well, you can do a cookie where you get the browser string, right? And then you ask the user for information like their zip code, and then you can guess, within a certain amount of, let's say there's 5 or 6 people in the same zip code who may match those browser traits. Or maybe you ask for the zip code and you ask for the birth date, and now you can just mail out, 5 mailers to the 5 people who have the same birth date and the same zip code, or whatever it is, right? So this idea that a small amount of information aggregated, and the bigger these profiles get, of course, they get more powerful, but even a small amount of information aggregated can give you insight into who someone is on the other side of the screen. That was already with me when I started playing around with social media. And there were a lot of different social networks. Obviously, we had MySpace before that. But there were other things like Zookwa and all these other weird networks that had these different incentivizing schemes for keeping you in the network. And yeah, it was obvious to me that there could be a privacy issue. I wasn't fully aware of how things were going until the technologies sort of grew up a little more. So you had a technological shift into what people started calling Web 2.0, right? Which meant that a lot of the code was being computed out of the control of not just the user, but the intermediary, right? So Facebook would be running things off who knows whose server, right? And there'd be these cobbled together websites with tons of different stuff shoved into them. So it became sort of obvious at that point. And then catalyzing moment for me, of course, the Free Software Foundation was very much aware of this. The Software Freedom Law Center and Eben Moglen over there gave a couple speeches about the issue with centralized social media, which really what social media does is create a walled garden, right? In some ways, it's not that different than what AOL was trying to do in the 90s. They were more successful at it, and they were able to keep people in much more than I thought they would be able to. So yeah, it wasn't so much about directly knowing exactly what the privacy practices were. It was about knowing that they weren't a trustworthy intermediary, right? That there was no reason to trust that their privacy practices were any good. And then when we found out all the stuff, Cambridge Analytica, et cetera, for me, again, it was another moment that was kind of interesting because it was like, well, people who have been in the free software movement or, talking about tech privacy, Electronic Freedom Foundation, et cetera, all those people were talking about these issues. And, if you're in the EFF and you don't know that Facebook is bad by, what year was that? 2016, you should have. So yeah, what I think is cool about your generation is, you've grown up with smartphones in a very real sense, and we have not, right? Or we did not. And I think that does color a little differently your perception, at least at the start, of trust in these intermediaries again, right? When you get a phone, you get a cool iPhone, right, and you're in middle school, and you've got a bunch of icons on the desktop, you say, well, how bad could these things be? You know, these things are shipped in a product. They're being used by everybody. They're being used by my teachers and my administrators and my parents and me, right?
A step above that, you don't even think about those things. It's just, oh, I got a cool new gadget. Like what's yeah, it's a new gaming console essentially for a middle schooler.
Yeah. So I mean, and that's something I think I have to, you know, come to grips with when I try to teach folks who are trying to, you know, have conversations with your generation. Need to think about that. And you know, I'm not that old yet, but I feel old because of the pace of the internet. So.
Well, what's interesting for me is that I'm already seeing this myself. So I have done some volunteer work where I teach basic programming and cybersecurity through Scratch to elementary schoolers. When I was in elementary school, I was learning how to type, and I barely ever touched the computer. These kids have Chromebooks. They're in second, third grade, and they're typing in URLs like it's nothing. So they're even younger than I was using this technology. So I guess I can kind of relate there. And there's a huge degree of trust. Absolutely, and it's not something that most people think about, which is just odd. The fact that you have second graders using Google devices all the way throughout their education experience, all the way through college, is just insane. That a company can have that much control over an individual.
I think it's awesome that we can have the conversation now. You know, so I know a lot of educators. I've always thought of myself primarily as an educator. I know a lot of people who teach high school and so on. And, you know, maybe that's just the crowd I ended up in. We weren't the bad crowd. We ended up being teachers. But whatever the case, you know, these folks we're already worried about the implementation of Chromebooks from a pedagogical standpoint, right? You know, what's going to happen when I'm forced to use a cart full of Chromebooks to teach students who I'm already having issues, you know, keeping control in the classroom, or trying to get the information across I'm getting across, or some other, you know, learning disabilities and so on, right? So I think there was already a worry amongst teachers about that. But now we can talk about the privacy and trust issues. Google doesn't quite have the shining, you know, visage that it had, you know, 10 years ago, where it was like, well, everything Google's doing is amazing, and look how cool the Googleplex is, where all the workers get to hang out all day, you know, and all that stuff. So that veneer is sort of, you know, starting to you know, be scratched and broken a little bit. I don't know what's going to happen with COVID-19. I mean, for the first time, policies were just thrown out the window, and it was, you know, okay, now you can bring home your Chromebook, et cetera, because they just had no way to do instruction otherwise. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what that transition is. But what we should be talking about, the things that folks were talking about with the one laptop per child project a long time ago, you know, it's great for this technology to be in the hands of young people, right? But we need to think about who controls that technology ultimately, and how deeply there's control there. If anyone controls the stack, the technological stack that they implement well and strongly, I guess I would say Apple first, and then Google, right? Google's very good at controlling that stack. And as you know, these Chromebooks can do all amazing things like the teaching you're talking about. But I'd like to see them be running free operating systems as well, which we know they can do. But in most cases, they're just not. So,
yeah, agreed there. I guess you brought up coronavirus, and that's the second question. So how has coronavirus been affecting you and your work? And it's more of a broad question there, but I'm sure everyone's affected differently.
yeah. So for me, the realization set in more slowly than it should have, that this pandemic would be affecting not only me directly, but the country so strongly. I'm in New Haven, Connecticut. I'm right near New York. We've had a lot of cases here. We were one of the early states to have a heavy amount of cases. Obviously, I'm at Yale University. We had some cases there. They had to close school, you know, send everybody home very abruptly, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So all that stuff went on. I think for me, Personally, you know, I haven't suffered directly yet. I am very worried about people in my family who are immunocompromised, et cetera. But for me, it's been a catalyzing moment to sort of reassess the work I do, try to shift some aspects of that work. For example, we organized under the PrivacySafe, the organization that I'll talk about in a little bit. We organized something called Flatten the Curve Summit. We got some great speakers to do a remote conference talking about COVID-19, talking about the public health impacts, but not only just the public health impacts, some of this technological surveillance stuff that we all are worried about, right? So what's going to happen with contact tracing? What can we expect to go on in healthcare from a technological standpoint? And we got some great folks. We got Luis Falcone from GNU Health talking. We got Cory Doctorow talking. We got Trish Greenhalgh from University of Oxford talking about the remote assessment of patients, which is very cool stuff. Obviously, if you can assess at least some of the symptoms of COVID-19 and try to make a determination from a distance, it's better for the healthcare provider and better for the individual and really society, not spreading it, right, as much as possible. So there's a lot of very cool stuff. I guess for me, it's just, it has had a pretty mega impact. I think we're all going to look back on this time as being, a pretty big catalyst for change in our lives. And yeah, so it has changed my work. As far as PrivacySafe is concerned, so PrivacySafe is a company that I started in 2019. We were doing for-profit work where we were selling IoT devices, basically free and open source software with open hardware, and trying to do cool things with it, such as secure storage, et cetera, et cetera. With COVID-19, we hit a bit of a wall. A lot of small businesses did. But we also, we're staggering a little bit on some of our projects, right? We were doing some enterprise contracts, et cetera. And the areas we were doing them in were healthcare and education. So it made sense for us to form a nonprofit foundation and then to focus on remote education, to focus on healthcare. So do that work with GNU Health, put a hospital information system on a little decentralized single board computer, right? To work on that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's been a really recentering event now that I'm thinking about it. And it's only been, so I've been inside since, early March and isolated since early March. And that's what, 8 weeks? So it's kind of wild.
Time's flown. It's honestly, it's felt like just 2 or 3 weeks. Time just, I feel like there's been a total loss of just time. This whole gap. The semester's already over. It's insane. I feel like this stuff just started just a few weeks ago. What are your thoughts on the contact tracing? Have you found something that is promising and also doesn't invade user privacy? I know the EU tried creating one, and then Germany went ahead and said that's not good. They tried making their own, and then Switzerland said they're making their own because the EU one wasn't good apparently. So the contact tracing just has been a complete mess. Has there been something that you found to be promising?
Yeah, so contact tracing to me is very scary, and I'm very worried about it for a number of reasons. But I've talked a little bit about this, and I'll try my best not to just throw out the baby with the bathwater. I do know that epidemiologists and public health officials and so on, experts in that area, are saying, look, contact tracing works, right? The idea that where there's a cluster of people who are likely to get COVID-19 or some other disease, or where it's occurring and spreading, that's really, really valuable from a public health standpoint. So I don't want to poo-poo those things and throw them out and say they're not worthwhile. However, the idea that we would have two of the biggest surveillance capitalists in the history, really the biggest surveillance apparatuses in the history of humanity, being in charge of this, Apple and Google, is very disconcerting to me, to put it mildly. I do know there's some proposals that are hypothetically possible. I apologize for my birds, by the way. It's like a little fun in here. But anyway, so Yeah, there are some proposals that can hypothetically work, right? The Chaos Communication Congress, the CCC, incredible tech folks in Germany, know a lot about surveillance and anti-surveillance technology, of course, implementing secure systems, etc. They have backed a proposal, more or less, said, okay, you can do it this way. There's been some other groups that have shown, okay, you can do it this way. Look, we know how to do voting securely and anonymously and with verification. Encryption of one kind or another gives us all these tools, right? Setting up a system that does secure private communication that also allows the people on both ends to verify that they're talking to the correct person, or very likely talking to the correct person. That's also possible, right? How many of those systems do we have? Very few in the wild. They've had to be fought for really hard. And something like voting, right? If we were to implement voting in the current situation in the United States or a lot of other places digitally, I would not expect it to do, real private, real secure, real, anonymous, be a real anonymous system. Same thing with contact tracing. Now, that all said, it became very obvious to me early on that as soon as Google and Apple threw their hat into the ring, that they would just destroy all competitors, and that's pretty much what they did.
Yeah.
I
mean, it makes sense because everyone either has iOS or Android, so if they're going to make something that's universal, it's probably the way to go.
Right, right. And so the proposals in Germany and the proposals in Switzerland and some of the stuff I've seen in other places were pretty much thrown out. There are other places. Norway, for example, has pretty extensive contact tracing already in place. They've actually worked on that for a long time. I can't remember the name of the corporation. I don't want to screw it up, but their main national cell phone corporation, it's like Norvitel or something like that. They were already working in this area in Bangladesh, in other parts of the world to track disease. And my understanding is that those systems have some pretty severe flaws from a privacy standpoint. So the alternatives also, I think, are worrisome. I also want to question the, the real use cases. Is this stuff going to actually be valuable? Is this stuff going to do what it says it's going to do? For me, the technology has two major flaws from a technical design standpoint. The first one is that we already know social graphs very quickly get out of control. So if I know you and you know someone and then they know someone, right? As you get 2 or 3 orders out, you already are encompassing massive amounts of people, right? Who are in these social circles, right? And in places like a city, major metropolitan areas, which are where contact tracing hypothetically should be most valuable, I'm not certain that the technology is going to be very valuable because of the amount of people that you could potentially come into contact in your day-to-day just transactional business. Forget about socializing, right? So what it amounts to me is somebody getting a warning on their phone that's going to be about as useful as the click-through screens when Windows first shifted to user account control, right? People were just clicking through that stuff. Agree. Or ignored in some way because people need to go to work, right? If I have a family that I need to support, and I'm one of the lucky people to be able to work at right now, and get money, and I'm afraid of losing that job, I'm going to have to now choose between, believing this app or, going to work. And I think most people are going to choose to go to work. The other thing is Bluetooth technology is really wonky. So I've done a lot of implementation on those little IoT devices, and I don't have a Beagle board around. I should have grabbed one before the interview. But anyway, a lot of people know what Beagle boards look like. We've done some Bluetooth work with PrivacySafe for some very cool stuff. And it's hard to, guess how two devices are going to come into contact with each other or communicate with each other. In a lot of cases, Bluetooth is just short-range wireless, and it can be blocked by a lot of things. It can be enabled by a lot of things. So in some cases, you know, you can have Bluetooth extend out many, many yards, right, or meters. And in some cases, it will be blocked by some simple wall or refrigerator or a microwave or something. And I don't want to be on a city bus with a phone that I've been forced to have, or an app I've been forced to have on that phone. And when the bus stops, you know, I'm considered in contact with people who are walking by the bus on the street. You know, those kinds of things are kind of silly to me. In a skyscraper where you've got windows, I don't see how this is going to work. You know, there's a lot of cases where I just don't, you know, in traffic on the freeway, I don't see how this is going to work. So I think we need to question also the efficacy of the technology, not just the surveillance aspects of it.
Yeah. The crazy, I think that when there is such a big disaster or something that's happening, it's really easy for people to just hop on whatever solutions introduced. We saw the same thing after 9/11. We just implemented all the surveillance technology because that was the right thing to do. We're seeing the same thing now with the pandemic, right? How are we going to address this? We don't know, but we're going to throw everything we can at it. I guess that's been kind of the dangerous pattern that's been occurring recently with surveillance.
Yeah, so what I would say there, look, if I had the huge war chests of money and I had the cultural significance that both Google and Apple have in America, right, in this country, which is failing miserably at its response to COVID-19, is becoming a real example of what not to do worldwide. You know, if I had that kind of money and power, I would want to not look at technology first as the solution. And I think there's other ulterior motives, of course, why Google and Apple are doing this. If that money was put instead into just hiring armies of people to do phone surveys, you know, they would probably be way more effective. Instead, we're seeing just a couple states doing that, Massachusetts, my state, Connecticut as well.
What are those? I've never heard of them before.
Yeah, so contact tracing traditionally is done by people just calling around, basically.
Never heard of that before. I've just heard of the phones.
Well, so these are the traditional models, right? How were Nielsen ratings done for television back in the day? How were, you know, there's a certain amount of science behind statistics and public surveys and public research that goes back at least to the turn of the 20th century. And you can argue about, you know, how good polling is, et cetera, et cetera. And we all know, you know, we're like, oh, what's this crap call? And we don't want to answer it, or we hear it and we hang up, et cetera. But, you know, there are experts who do this sort of thing, who are very good at figuring out models, what groups should be contacted, how to cover a lot of different demographics and income groups, et cetera, et cetera. You know, and I'd rather see them try to do contact tracing and come up with ways to do it. I'm sure even there's issues with data disclosure and centralization of information, right? We know that when information is centralized, whether it's in a paper file cabinet or not, you know, you're creating a weakness, right? And the more information that's in that file cabinet, the more it's valuable to people from a cyber criminal standpoint, or to the NSA and the CIA, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, not to get too off topic, I do think if Google and Apple were to put their money into that, think about the impact they could have had, right? Now, that's not cool and high tech, and it doesn't help their, you know, hegemony, right? They're putting this stuff in the Bluetooth stack. You know, Apple already has iBeacon, which is the de facto Bluetooth proximity tracking technology. Google used to have Eddystone, then spun that out, but now is getting back into this stuff. They're going to make sure the Android stack has these contact tracing features very low in the operating system, and very likely out of the control of users, or at least unless you're going to put a separate ROM right on your phone.
I love GrapheneOS.
Yeah.
It's how to avoid everything.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, Graphene's great. I still have a phone here running Lineage. I haven't switched to Graphene. I played around with it on another device, but all of those ROMs are great. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I came from Lineage too, and I bought the 3A XL just for Graphene. It's just been phenomenal.
Cool. But you see how you have to buy a specific model, right?
Exactly. Like, for most people, it's just not the norm you have to do. Most people aren't going to buy a new phone just to flash a custom ROM. It's just not the norm.
And it's one of the reasons you can't even do workshops around it, right? So I've done a lot of digital self-defense workshops where it's like, use Tor browser, here's how to do. But now that time's gone on, everybody's doing everything on their smartphones. Eventually the question comes up, what are we going to do about this problem? And I'm not going to, even attempt in a room full of people to try to, flash ROMs on phones, et cetera. It just wouldn't work out. So, yeah.
To cycle back to, I guess, you and your work, I don't know how many of my viewers know what Yale Privacy Lab is. So do you mind explaining a little bit about the lab, what you do, what the lab does, the history, and also your future plans?
Sure. So Yale Privacy Lab is an initiative of something called the Information Society Project. That's a sort of our umbrella supporting group that's inside of Yale Law School. So if you've heard of the Berkman Klein Center in Harvard, Yale ISP, Information Society Project, is sort of the counterpart of that at Yale Law School. It actually predates it slightly, which we're very proud of. But our focus is a little different. ISP tends to be more about policy and regulation and law, because it's at the law school. So Privacy Lab is an initiative that I started in 2017. And we were already doing digital self-defense workshops, crypto parties, as we used to call them, and those kinds of things to show lawyers how to be more secure, talking to, in the legal clinics, talking to people who were at risk, let's say, or just talking to each other, or, et cetera, et cetera. So we used to do that kind of work, and then formed an official initiative as Privacy Lab, where the idea was, okay, we're going to do that work. We're going to do those workshops. We're going to come up with curriculum. We're going to do presentations on specific topics. So when something comes up like Cambridge Analytica, then, do sort of a teach-in about it, right? What are the issues here, et cetera, et cetera. But also to do some research. So the first thing we did was do some static analysis of Android apps. So we looked at Android apps that had what we call trackers in them. These are software development kits or SDKs, snippets of code. You can think of them as.
Have you seen Sieg Egelman's work with App Census? What do you think of that?
Yeah, so all that stuff is great, right? F-Droid's done a lot of good work in this area. Exodus Privacy is a group we worked with. There's a huge problem with the ecosystem, right? Android apps and iOS apps also are filled with a massive amount of code that is not controlled by the user, that is coming from all kinds of third parties, that has all of these, tertiary bits and stuff coming in from all over the place, and these dependencies and so on. And finding that stuff, right, tracking it using machine learning, right, and those cool technologies to figure out what's actually in an app and what the privacy leakage might be, is an entire field basically now. And in 2017, basically, it was known that this stuff was in a lot of apps, but I don't think there were a lot of universities or major universities or just places trying to shine a spotlight onto the problem. So our role was basically that, shining the spotlight on the problem. We relied on a lot of good work of others, as we always do, with free software, free and open source software, of course. Exodus Privacy being the primary one. And you can go out to exodus-privacy.eu.org and check it out, the amount of work they've done since then. When we first started talking about this and getting some press, we got a story in The Intercept, story in Le Monde, which is a French paper, and a lot of coverage, internationally. We were looking at about 300 apps and a handful of trackers, what we were calling trackers, right? Now there's hundreds of trackers that have been identified, at least, and thousands of apps that have been looked at. So that's the kind of stuff we do. Right now I'm working on some very cool stuff with network analysis. we were supposed to announce that. I was supposed to basically do a presentation at a conference in March about big tech and antitrust. That was canceled, or at least moved to October. So I expect in the fall I'll have another cool announcement to make. So
That's cool. Great stuff. I really like what you do. I'm in a cybersecurity research lab at my university. And so it's really cool hearing all the privacy stuff that you do. Yeah, I love it. You talked about the next question is about PrivacySafe. I was going to ask you about that, but you already touched on it. Do you have anything else you wanted to add about PrivacySafe that you haven't already talked about?
Sure. So, we started the project to bring a full free software stack with open hardware and do things like decentralized secure storage. We got some support in that. We're still working on the code for all of that, but primarily we've shifted to healthcare. It makes more sense in the environment we're in, and we sort of had that on the back burner, but we moved that to the front burner. And, as I said, we have a nonprofit focus now, right? We are looking at doing stuff that is very strictly civically minded, education minded, social good directly. So one of the things we're doing is remote learning. So we're using a stack that is free software to bring classes to people that are, for example, digital self-defense classes. And we want to have basically members join the foundation. You get a certain amount of classes depending on what tier you join at. The prices are all very reasonable, $2 a month, $5 a month, $8 a month. And then you can interface directly with the people teaching the class, with the instructors. We're also offering a Matrix encrypted chat to go along with that. So the idea is, hey, there's a lot of people offering free teaching online right now, but there's also a lot of content creators and academics and just the experts in areas that are trying to bring their content online for the first time. We want to be a place where you can bring your content, know that it's going to be under free culture, Creative Commons licenses, so you own it, right? And the people who take the classes own it in a very real sense, right? And then also we have no surveillance built into the stack. So unlike Coursera, for example, we are not trying to analyze our users. We're not shoving in third-party code from big tech. We're not trying to, look at their conversations or any of that stuff, which a school would do, or now more often bosses are doing as well, unfortunately. So all that stuff we want to kind of be a bit of an example against. So if there are any content creators or folks who want to teach, primarily right now, I want to reach out to them and say, hey, let's get you set up. Let's get some classes in there. And then if folks want to see how that builds, we've got a few classes coming up in June, and then we'll keep moving throughout the summer. But I expect by the fall, we'll really have a lot of content in there. So
that's great. Great initiative. I personally have tried looking for avenues to share Go Incognito, our course, and I've been trying to find something that's decent and I guess more liberating and fast. And Udemy is what I came out with. So, as you know, that's not a great option. So I'm still searching.
Yeah, so Udemy, Cybrary, all these things are out there, and I don't think the missions are necessarily bad in these places, but part of the profit model that's just come up, and a lot of people are participating in it. It doesn't mean they're bad people or that the companies are necessarily trying to be bad companies, but there is this idea that it's okay just to look at everything that your users do, and that part of your value add is having that information. If it's not your only value add in some cases. A lot of that's going to shift. The market's blown up completely right now. We're seeing for the first time some of the free culture and open source values being taken seriously, where there's restrictions on patents thrown out the window, et cetera, et cetera. And it's because of a crisis, but I think if we can really start looking at those forms of organization seriously and trying to take that torch forward past the pandemic, we're going to be on better footing than we were before it. So yeah, let's see what happens. And if nothing else, we'll teach a bunch of people some very cool stuff and move on to the next thing if we have to. So
great, I love it. And on the topic of, I guess, alternatives to the main stuff, to bring it back to phones, I stalked your resume a little bit on your site, and I saw you did some work with Purism in the past. So, what'd you do for them? How was that?
Sure. Yeah. So I worked for Purism primarily in a business development, sales sort of role. Did a little bit of marketing and so on, from last October to last year to May. And so I worked with them throughout some of the Librem 5 work they were doing and some of the early stuff for the Librem 1, the social stack that Purism put together. I think I wish them all the best. For me, it was time to move on to some other projects. I think the community has seen a lot of other alternatives to the Librem 5 come up. There's been a little bit of start-stop with the phone. And yeah, that's no mystery to anybody. But
Yeah, I'm pre-ordered, so I'm going through it myself for the phone.
yeah, so I didn't do any direct engineering work or anything like that. I'm just an advocate and supporter of the work they were doing. I have some skepticism about it, to be frank, but I don't, again, I think they're trying to do good work, and it's just the implementation is a little lacking.
Yeah, no, I'm pretty much on the same boat as you are. I want them to succeed. I think that we should all want them to succeed. There's just definitely some issues along the way. And the fact that I'm seeing a $2,000 US version coming out to me is just like, whoa.
Yeah, so the
um,
hardware business is difficult. One of the things with PrivacySafe, we wanted to have US assembly as much as possible too, which is one of the reasons we went with BeagleBoard. And we're saying, hey, we're going to have BeagleBoard AI. This is a very cool platform. The components are freer in a way than Raspberry Pi is, for example. But also, it's coming from the US, right? So knowing that supply chain gives you a heightened amount of security. So I do understand what they're going for there, but the price constraints also are a lot higher, right? When you're not relying upon what's basically slave labor in Asia, your components are going to cost more money. And this is something as a society we need to be frank and serious about. I know I tend to use strong language, but it is really an issue. Trying to sell someone on the idea of doing US only assembly, let alone manufacturing of all the components, was a difficult thing to do a year ago, right? Now things might change a little bit in that area with everything that's happened with COVID. What's going to be challenging, and the biggest challenge that all of these projects have, and they're of course not only quite aware of it, but having to expend a massive amount of effort on Pine 64 and the rest of them as well, is working on the chipset. Right. If you don't do your own SoC, system on a chip design, and make sure that every component is under your control, you have a hole in your security model. And silicon is not pushed out in many places, right? In the US right now, there aren't many places that will do anything but custom work in small runs. And that amount of investment may come back, but we're talking trillions and trillions of dollars to do the kind of thing like what's happening in China. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me that the American-only version would be priced that highly. But I guess the idea is if you're an enterprise and you're serious about it, I don't know.
yeah. Great notes. Side note, like everything you say just makes me rethink almost everything I know. So I hope that the community is able to really appreciate the fact that you came on to do this interview. Next thing, of all these projects and everything you've worked on, it doesn't even have to be something that you've done. What's been kind of your favorite project along the way? What's something that you always look back on and think, man, that was the number one thing? Or is it something you do today?
Yeah, so I think that Android story is still, the 2017 thing is still the thing that I have to come back to, and I'm always trying to not chase it, but want to get back to that level. That was a really good example of working with an international team together on something that we knew was going to be explosive. and trying to make sure that we told the story correctly, communicated with each other correctly, and also worked with the press, which was my first experience working with the press in that kind of way. So yeah, that work was not only a little technically challenging, but also from a collaborative standpoint, hectic but fun when I look back on it. I also did some stuff with Freedom Box Foundation. You know, I still love the work that they do there with Freedom Box. I worked on some of the early UI for Plinth, which is the administrative back end for that. I look on that very fondly as well. The coolest, best projects that come out, you know, I don't know. I think we're starting to see some of them. Since you brought up the phones, I am very excited about what Pine 64 is doing and how that stuff is hitting. I think that's going to make some massive changes moving forward. We'll have to see, you know, where hardware goes and how the adoption of the issue that I'm worried about, and one of the reasons contact tracing is problematic, is you know, we may start seeing pressure from entities, from institutions where we have not yet seen much pressure, telling us what we can run and what we need to have in our pockets to even be able to be autonomous at all, to move around the space we're in, right? To go to work, to be hired for a job, to go to school. So
it's already happening. There was a job I applied for not too long ago, which was similar to that volunteer position for elementary schools. The way that you, as an instructor, as a lecturer for these after-school programs, the way that you signed up was through a mobile app. The mobile app required Google Play services. I couldn't become a part of this program unless I had a separate device that supported the app. So that's already happening, where you have to have either iOS or Android with running Google Play services to be a part of society.
yeah, and it's unreal. And all of the workarounds, you know, I mean, they're just workarounds, right? And they work half the time, you know, and the devs are constantly playing a cat and mouse game with Google in this example, yep. Right? You're 100% right. Now, we're used to that problem, right, in a sense, because Microsoft, especially through the 90s and early 2000s, was so dominant. We're used to the idea of being forced into these proprietary, you know, ecosystems. We've come up with some clever workarounds and some ecosystems around them. And maybe, you know, you have a burner phone that you have to use for your job because it has Google Play services, et cetera. For me, that's bad enough. And you're 100% right. We should be worried about that. However, the thing that I'm more concerned about now is that we're going to have to use the devices in our pockets for identification. You know, there's this ID 2020 project that the Gates Foundation is one of the sponsors of. It's being touted as potentially a hygienic solution to transactions during the pandemic, but not only transactions, voting, right? I'm worried that that kind of thing is going to happen too, where it's, okay, now you carry this thing in your pocket, and it's not just for one single purpose. It is the only way that you can get, you know, like I said, in a bus, you know, on a train, on a plane, buy something at the store, you know.
You're going into like a cashless society now where cash is just irrelevant.
Right. So that sort of thing, you know, worries me. Not to get dystopian when you ask me a positive question, but, you know, it tends to be where I go.
Well, on the positive, I'm seeing more and more projects. I feel like every other month I hear about a new phone project. So I actually it's actually right behind me. There's an E phone. I don't know if you've heard of the E Foundation. There's a phone there that I'm reviewing. It's going to come out next week. There's LineageOS. There's tons of custom ROM projects. Daniel McKay, the developer for GrapheneOS, he's said that he wants to create his own phone one day that's going to run with GrapheneOS. So the demand is there, and it seems like there's developers, obviously Purism and Pine 64. We have projects. It's just a matter of... And it's sad because over the years we've had so many failed projects as well. You have the Ubuntu phone. You have... didn't Firefox make a phone?
Yeah, and I had that phone. That was an interesting project. But, you know, I mean, it goes to show how hard these things are. And also the barriers aren't necessarily... So there's a lot of times when we talk about this stuff and we see sort of a flourishing of this stuff, it does mean there's a demand, like you say, right? And there are people out there talking about privacy enough that you can sell these products and get them in people's hands. However, the scale of implementation that's required, right, to get this thing to be have 5% of the market share, let's say, or 1% even in a lot of cases, requires so much inertia that it can be difficult to make something sustainable. And the issue that Firefox OS had, in my opinion, was that they were barred from a lot of the markets that were most interested in the product. So basically, they weren't able to get US carriers to support that phone at all. They've had some issues in Europe. If you, and I did, if you can buy the phone, but then you have to spend hours of your life on tech support, talking to someone just to get it activated, right? Because of some bizarre SIM rule or something that the carrier has, that's where the hegemony lies. And really, in an economics we're talking about, markets being barred from access, right? We're talking about real monopolization. And I think, unfortunately, if we lose that war, right, if it becomes, okay, you can buy these cool gadgets if you want to be a weirdo, but you can't use them for anything really functional in the places where they are most likely to be embraced, like the United States, then they become something that maybe we have in the global south. Then you have issues with distribution and so on, because you now have U.S. companies trying to distribute, or European countries trying to distribute sort of out of their, home markets. That stuff becomes problematic. It's the kind of thing we saw with the One Laptop Per Child project and some of those projects in that time period, when the storyline was, hey, we didn't have smartphones yet, but it was, if we can just get netbooks in everybody's hands, right? Think about how liberatory that would be. And now that's sort of what we're seeing with smartphones. I'm psyched about everything that's going on. I think there's going to be a lot more work. We're going to have to support those projects. And supporting them is going to be difficult. It's also going to take some diplomacy, right? Diversity is going to be there. There are going to be a lot of different devs and a lot of different projects working in sort of cross purposes in a lot of ways. And that's the story of the Linux distro, right? We're used to this with even, when people took GNU and just, started modding it out, and adding little pieces to it in the early days. So we have to try not to be too, I don't know. We need to not go to war with each other also.
So I just have a few more questions left, and they're kind of more broad questions that I think are just applicable to all privacy people. And I know it's probably close to an hour now, so I don't want to take up too much of your time. So feel free to go through these questions. All right. So my first question is, what are 3 things you'd recommend to each person as the first things they should do to reclaim their privacy for someone who's completely new to this business?
Apologies for my dog. I swear he was going to be good. We got a cat, we got birds, we got a lot of animals in the house. That's one of the things that keeps me going. Can you go back into the question? I was worried about the animal.
Yeah. So what are 3 things that you would tell someone who's brand new to the privacy scene that you think would be the best for them to reclaim their privacy? I know there's a million things you could talk about, but what are like the 3 big ones that you would tell them?
Sure. So ad blockers first. That's easy. People can install that in their browser and more often on their phones. So using an ad blocker in your browser, or a browser that is more private. So the Brave browser is a very good with built-in default features now. If you can use that, goes a long way in reclaiming your privacy off the bat without you doing anything passively. Right. That's the first thing Yep.
It's based off Chromium too. I've switched over so many people I know to Brave because I just tell them, look, it's the same thing as Chrome. It's just better and it's faster. I like Brave a lot. It's just a great out of the box solution.
Yeah, and I initially had some skepticism about the Brave attention token and sort of that thing, but it is what it is, and if that's their way of monetizing and keeping the platform going, then they are.
Well, luckily, that's still by default, it is off. That's kind of... I do have concerns in the long run, though. I have a feeling they're going to integrate that more into the browser. We're already starting to see things like the Binance widget, and you have the cryptocurrency wallet built into the browser. As long as everything can be disabled, I'm happy. But I guess the long-term concern is that they're going to start integrating those things more and more.
Yeah, and thankfully it's free software, right? So whatever features are there, since it basically is Chromium, hypothetically it can get spinned off if something goes on. But these companies are going to have more and more pressure put on them, to put it mildly, to monetize. And you're going to see a lot more. That's a business development alliance, right, between Binance and Brave. And it makes a lot of sense for both of them, but it can be a turnoff for folks who are not into blockchain, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt the three things.
That's the whole point of the conversation, not just me talking, man. So not a problem. Feel free to. I tend to go off on a thought train. But so ad blockers, the first one. The second thing that I ask people to do is download and install Tor browser. Tor browser on the desktop, and now also Tor browser on Android, are a huge step forward for anybody who wants to not only be more private and actually anonymous, but to think about privacy and have sort of a concept that another world is possible. Now that step, as I'm sure you know, is not as simple. You drop somebody into Tor and they pull up Google and it's got, check, language text on it, or Cyrillic characters or something, and folks are, in the US at least, are very baffled by this. We're not even used to, bilingual stuff really. So that can be an issue, and you've got to show folks that. You've got to be like, well, you might have to click through 1 million captchas if you're using,
it's horrible. Horrible.
Those kinds of things. And also potentially privacy risk, right? I'm glad some people are actually talking about captchas as a little bit of a sidebar as the privacy risk that they potentially are. But also, I don't want to be training Google's AI. I don't want to have to do that just to authenticate myself. It's just nonsense. But anyway, so Tor browser, I push Tor very hard. I think there's a good reason to also push Tor, because they need the support, right? So unfortunately, they had to let some people go, right?
Yeah, that was sad.
And that's what's going to happen. We're going to see some of the organizations that we rely upon for a lot of the infrastructure. I mean, how many projects in the privacy and security sphere rely on Tor in some way? I know the stuff we were doing for PrivacySafe, and we are going to continue doing, but in a little bit of a different way. We're going to do onion addressing, right? Hidden services / onion services. And without Tor and good infrastructure behind Tor and good improvements and patching, right, Tor becomes untenable. It is something that requires, at this point, quite a bit of infrastructure to keep running, but also experts to keep working on it. So anyway, they're going to need support. So it's good to show people Tor for that reason as well. And also, obviously, if you can, get people to use technologies like, onion shares, a pretty good way, a really good way of sending stuff over the network worldwide. Which you can use in conjunction with Tor browser. So ad blocker first, Tor next. Yep.
I love that tip because something I'm a big proponent for is the normalization of Tor, because there's such a negative connotation with it, which is, it's this evil, illegal, dark, mysterious place. When in reality, when you boot up the Tor browser, it's just like any other browser. And if you want to access Onion services, then there's that option as well. I think the one thing to add to your second point is that people also need to know, just because you're using Tor doesn't mean you're anonymous, right? If you're logging into a Google account, that's your personal Google account that you normally log into in your normal browser through Tor, it's not really doing you any good. So it's more so a matter of understanding how Tor works and how you can offload things that otherwise would be personally identifiable to this anonymity browser.
From a pedagogical standpoint, right, from a teaching standpoint, that's why it's so useful. Because now you can say, you can hold that against the Facebook and say, up the two things next to each other and say, well, okay, Facebook's tracking you, even using this cool stuff that obfuscates your information in this awesome way, right? If you go to this website and you log in, they're building profiles on you, and those demographic profiles are going to be, still following you. And they're going to know you're using Tor, right? Which may also put you in some other bottle or some other category that, they have on the back end and share with third parties, et cetera, et cetera. But it's very useful from that standpoint. Of course, built into Tor browser now as a default search engine is DuckDuckGo, which I haven't used Google in a really long time. So, and when I do, I use it through DuckDuckGo. So, you know,
G tag.
yeah, exactly. The bang, the exclamation point G, and that's very useful. And I get so used to it when I'm not on my machine. Like I'm trying to search Wikipedia and I do exclamation point W. You know, I'm like, oh crap. You know?
It's a great feature. It's grown on me too. I recently, so maybe I'm biased because I started interning for Startpage, so I'm doing some like creative content for them, and I miss the bang feature. So I've moved them to my default search engine just because obviously I get to talk to their engineers and now I trust them the most personally. And I miss the bang. That's the one thing I keep pushing. It's like, when can there be bangs? Because sometimes even Startpage, what you learn about Startpage is even though they supply Google results, it's still not as good as when you use google.com because Google adds another layer of personalization. And the personalization is really the secret sauce here. It's not really... Sure, Google results are the most indexed and they might be the most the best in general, but that's not really why Google results are so good for the end user. It's all the personalization that goes into the search, which makes Google just a phenomenal search engine.
Yeah, but conversely, I will say that filter bubble, right, is
Exactly.
a problem, right?
Yep.
And that's why Startpage is nice for most searches, at least for me, or if you use the DuckDuckGo GBang.
Yeah. Yeah, Startpage is great. Quant is another one that I think is reasonably good. I don't know a whole lot about it, but from what I can tell, they seem to be doing good things. Search engines are a hard thing to do in a decentralized way, but there are a couple projects to do that as well.
Search.me. Yeah. I saw different pronunciations. The X can be pronounced with like a ch sound in certain languages, so it's just search.me. I don't know. It's just whatever makes you happy.
Like a Chi character in Greek or something too. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Awesome. So anyway, yeah. So cool stuff. So Tor browser, and that it already introduces them to all those concepts, right? And when I tend to do in workshops or class Tor browser, we also do browser fingerprinting. So we'll compare Tor browser against just vanilla Firefox and show the difference in the browser fingerprint. And you can do that with the EFF's Panopticon. Click, thank you, .eff.org. So that's a very useful thing. So that's the second thing, Tor browser, and I guess it has a lot of mini little subtasks in it. And the third thing I've been trying to do more and more is getting folks to use F-Droid on Android. And even if we have a lot of iOS users in the room, and we tend to, especially I found at universities or elite universities like Yale, you'll have a lot of folks with Apple products in general. Even if they have iOS and they don't have Android, so they can't use F-Droid, which is the alternative free software app store. Everything's free in it, for gratis as well. But we still call them app stores because that wording has just become part of the lexicon. But anyway, it allows me to talk about some of the issues with centralization and ownership of the software delivery mechanism, right? So on an iPhone, we know that the App Store is trusted by a lot of Apple users. Puppy. I had a cat before yowling. I'm gonna get a studio, I swear, at some point, or at least set one up.
I need one too, man. It's hard recording videos and having to take down the lights every time.
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, it allows us to talk about those issues, right? So we can say, hey, software delivery, if it was done this way, right? If you had somebody actually being able to audit your apps down to the source code every time, search them automatically for trackers, right? So one of the things about X's privacy is that all of the tracker signatures that go into X's privacy, the ones we did at Yale Privacy Lab, but also ones that they do and ones submitted by third-party researchers or just users, all those tracker signatures, every app in F-Droid is checked against. So if a tracker has been identified, it's not going to end up in that app that's in F-Droid. So it allows me to sort of talk about the tracker work, etc. Unfortunately, unless you have Android users in the room, it can tend to be a little, difficult to go through. But, it does need to be talked about. It is the primary way an Android user can free up their phone. Even if they're unable to remove Google services, they can at least start using these other apps. versions that are in the Play Store many times don't. They're not always in the Play Store either. But when there are two versions of them, the F-Droid version is guaranteed not to use the Google Play stuff, which is huge.
And that brings up a good point to my audience. If you are, because so many people leave comments when I talk about Lineage or Graphene that they're on a locked bootloader. Even if you're on a locked bootloader and you're using Google Play services, you can still use third-party app stores like F-Droid. There's nothing stopping you. Android allows you to do that. It's great. It's not like iOS where everything is locked down. So just FYI.
Yep.
How do you feel about Aurora?
Aurora.
So in F-Droid, there's an app store called Aurora, which will allow you to anonymously. Personally, I use it because, for example, I have a Garmin that I use for running. I'm a big runner, and I have to use Garmin Connect. Well, I don't have to. The cool thing with the watch is you can actually keep everything local on the device. But I guess I like to consider myself a more advanced athlete, and I have to use the app to get all the full details of all my runs and everything like that. And Aurora is just magnificent in how it gives you an anonymous Google account that you log into, and you can download all free apps from the Google Play Store. Obviously, ideally, I get 99% of my apps from the F-Droid store, but it's great to get those Google Play alternatives for apps that will sometimes work without Google Play services.
Yeah, so what I use is the Yelp store.
Aurora's forks from Yelp, actually. It just adds a cool front end, which is, yeah.
Yeah, so I saw Aurora recently when I was looking for stuff. There's another one, too, I'm trying to think of the name of, that has a fancy front end. But I could swear there was some sort of pay model with it. It doesn't matter. But anyway, yeah, all those things are great. The issue is, of course, this is all on Google's good graces for having an authenticator token. That's true with gPlayCli, which is the command line client where you can download an APK directly from Google Play on your desktop. So when we do static analysis, right, and we want to look at an Android app, we'll download directly from Google Play as much as we possibly can. That way we have the hash of the file and we can verify 100% that this is the version of the APK that Google is distributing. But we can only do that using this token system where you don't have to log in using a Google Play account. And I don't know how long that's going to be around. And I know those devs that have worked on this stuff, they've had a lot of hiccups. Even in now using the Yelp store for however many years it's been around, 4 or 5 years, there's been times where it just doesn't work, and I go to GitHub and say, "Oh, geez, Google broke the authentication again." So it's a problem. Android's weird that way, though. I mean, I do think, and this is obviously a sidebar, but for folks who are modding their phone, it's good to know. I do think some of these alternative locations, APK Pure and so on, as long as you can verify that the hash is identical to the original APK that's in Google Play, there's no reason not to trust the file. And you usually can get the APK from somewhere. But yeah, more and more of those apps are, even an app that doesn't actually require Play services. Like you can look at the app and you can see, okay, it has these hooks in it, but it's not doing anything with GCM or Firebase or any of these things. They still will bark at you and say, well, this is required to use this app. And I've had that happen to me a lot, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's one project it's a long-term project. This is not something I'm planning on doing anytime soon, but I'm trying to find a way to build some kind of FOSS app that will scan the person's phone, and then a person can pretty much write in, and it's a community sourced, it'll write in what apps do and don't work with and without Google services. Because a question I constantly get is, will this app work without Google Play services? Will Spotify work? Will this app work? And there's really no way to verify unless you just ask people, like, hey, does this app work for you? And then people have to go and try it out. And it's really fun actually seeing what apps do and don't work, right? So the Garmin Connect app, for example, everything works perfectly, magically somehow. Like the Bluetooth syncing works, everything loads properly. The only thing that doesn't work is you can't load maps of your runs because obviously it uses Google Maps. The Tesla app works magically. You can connect to a car, no issues. But you can't use Google Maps to summon the car in the parking lot and do all those fancy, crazy features that are just insane. Yep. And some apps they give you warnings that you can't use this app without Google Play services, yet you just click OK and just use the app like normal, and there's absolutely no need for Google Play services.
Yeah.
So
the example I would recommend to you for that, and it's a little old-fashioned. I'm sure there's a much better way to do it with an app and a REST API and all this stuff to let people report easily from their phone. But Code Weavers, which is a company that's more or less behind a lot of the work, dev work that's done on Wine, not an emulation Windows layer in GNU Linux. So Crossover Office is the commercial product that CodeWeaver sells, which is a modified version of Wine. But they have a database. CodeWeavers has one where they rate apps saying how well they're going to run on Crossover Office. And it's gold, platinum, bronze, and then stars, and then user comments, and so on. And it has all the differences in the versions. It's just crowdsourced information.
That's really cool to know. Thank you. Because I haven't actually really looked into it because, like I said, it's a long-term project, but that's probably a great starting point.
And you know what? It doesn't have to be over-engineered in the beginning. Maybe just doing, setting up a wiki very quickly and seeing if there's interest. And then if there is interest, trying to get somebody to develop the app, is the way to go as well. So
that's not a bad idea. I just set up, I know I get backlash for using it, but I just set up GitHub for posting some of my stuff. So maybe just setting up a quick GitHub repo for that wouldn't be a bad idea.
Yeah, in the world we're in, I mean, GitLab, obviously, a lot of folks have switched to because of the non-Microsoft situation, and you can do self-hosting and so on. But, I mean, GitHub is so common as a platform. I do think if you want to engage with a wide swath of users, you're going to have something there.
Exactly. And obviously, what I post is public information. So the privacy concern of Microsoft is kind of, well, it's public. So so the three things. Sorry, this question got a really crazy.
That's good.
So the three things: ad blocking, a
browser, and then F-Droid, I would say.
F-Droid. So Tor browser and F-Droid. So those are the three Sean O'Brien approved tips for privacy noobs.
Yeah, I'll add that real quickly. If I had to do, and I used to do like a 30-second TLDR, I would talk about alternative social networking like Mastodon, and that's easy because you can just throw somebody the link and they can decide what they think of it, more or less. And then I used to do Jitsi Meet quite a bit. Say, hey, you can do video conferencing, without using these other things. Now the situation is a bit more complicated. I do like Big Blue Button a lot, which is what we're using at this moment. So maybe the conversation would be a little longer. But yeah.
Yeah. Signal too. Signal's great.
Absolutely. I used to have more caveats about it than I currently have, but yes.
Two more questions. And I think these will be a little bit shorter than the last one. So the first one is, what's your biggest fear as a privacy advocate? Are you more worried about, and I think I kind of got some insight based on our conversation, are you more worried about companies like Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Google, or are you more concerned about issues related to government surveillance? Or do you have something totally different that you're concerned about, or kind of all of the above? Just what are your concerns?
Yeah, so that's a tough question because these are public-private surveillance projects, right? Partnerships that go on. I think if you looked at my writing and a lot of the work that I've done, I do a lot of interviews with WikiLeaks groups and so on. You probably would assume that government surveillance is the thing that I'm most concerned about. But I kind of see institutions that are as large as big tech and all the Silicon Valley groups as being part of that same apparatus, right? So I don't want to necessarily artificially separate those two things. I suppose dragnet surveillance by governments is still more worrisome for a lot of reasons. Partially because those institutions are also destabilizing the globe via cyber war, right? So, the NSA and the CIA also have a role, in creating a massive amount of instability worldwide and some really scary situations by doing things like trying to attack not always just enemies, but sometimes allies, trying to get information or break systems, et cetera, et cetera.
Wasn't Japan a country that they could wipe out the entire power grid, the NSA?
Yeah, so I don't know about that specifically, but it would not surprise me. Two things to say about this, of course. The government, the military industrial complex, and the intelligence organizations that are attached to it, right? They have contingency plans for everything. So it doesn't necessarily mean that tomorrow you can flip a switch and turn off Japan's electric. Maybe it does, but in this case, like I said, I need to look into it. But it does mean that there's a plan to do that if the situation calls for it, whatever that means, right? But the other thing is you've got folks who are actively involved in, sort of these small cell groups, right? So if you're a part of the CIA's group, which I'm trying to think of the name of, the one that was responsible for the infiltration in Vault 7, if you followed the Vault 7 and Vault 8 stuff a few years ago. Okay, so a few years ago, it came to light that basically all of the hardware and software that the world relies on for their infrastructure was pwned in some way. It either had purposeful bugs inserted by the NSA or CIA or both into it, backdoors, for example, or it there were active attacks against it. So Cisco routers could be taken down that were used in pretty much everywhere. Firefox browser had some vulnerabilities. A lot of these were Windows-based, right? But some of them weren't. Some of them were on GNU Linux systems and Macs and so on. There were a lot of attacks against iPhones. There were a lot of attacks against Android and so on. This cache of information was disclosed by WikiLeaks, and WikiLeaks responsibly went through it, described the attacks without disclosing the code first, and then eventually disclosed most of the code as well after this stuff was patched. So that's a really scary example to look back on for the folks who may not be aware of it, of Vault 7, of nation state kind of trying to destabilize the technical infrastructure that we rely upon for everything. Another example, which is somewhat related, is the Eternal Blue weakness that was in Microsoft Windows networking that led to all of the waves of ransomware, right? That almost certainly, besides the NSA actually admitting that they did it, we know from all kinds of evidence that the NSA was actually responsible for inserting that backdoor. And they had so-called weaponized it, right? So you've got these cells, these groups of technologists who are working in the NSA in TAO, Tailored Access Operations is the name of the group. And they're coming up with not only the backdoors, but they're coming up with the exploits, and then they're making them really easy to command and control from a distance. So now you can have a relatively unskilled operative that maybe was trained up in a couple months, and they can click around some interface and they can attack some country, basically, with cyber war. But even if that doesn't happen, information wants to be free, the old adage, right? A lot of this stuff leaks out. In this case, it leaked out through a group called the Shadow Brokers. They disclosed the exploits, and we ended up with this huge wave of problems that we're still dealing with, right? Ransomware seems to keep coming back. And so I suppose in a very real, am I worried about, us ending up in nuclear war or some crazy thing happening, internationally, beyond the crazy instability that we see now with COVID-19, I am more worried about nation state actors in that sense. For personal privacy, I think dragnet surveillance is something, at least at the moment, that I think I'm able to realistically mitigate against. Targeted surveillance, I don't know how important anyone thinks I am at the moment, but if I am important, I'm not going to be able to stop targeted surveillance from nation state groups, but it's pretty easy for me to stop Google from spying on me if I know what to do. It's pretty easy for me to stop a lot of those things. So yeah, I don't know. I don't have an easy answer, but let's just say I'm more worried about nation states.
Spoken like a true professor.
Yeah, I don't have short answers. It's I'm not good with concision, basically.
No, I love the thorough answers, so it's great. It's better than just a simple I like this better, I like that better, or this is worse than this. And to end things on a positive note, I just thought this was a funny question. I think I already know the answer here, but what's your operating system of choice?
Sure. So I'm using Debian, which is a GNU Linux distro. I've used Ubuntu quite a bit and done a lot of installs of that as well. Debian, for me, is still the thing that's closest to my heart in a lot of ways. I try not to create distro wars, but I like the fact that there's a real community behind Debian, which some other distros don't necessarily have. And obviously, the package management and so on gives you a wide variety of software, which can be hard to find anywhere else. We are starting to see some changes in how that's operating with the Snap Store and so on, and GNOME shipping their stuff. Why can I think of it at the moment? The whole thing they're doing with one-click installer. But yeah, Debian still to me is closest, I think, to my heart. My desktop environment, if anyone cares, I've been using Mate or Mate because it's old-fashioned. I'm a little old-fashioned on that. So,
Hey, I'm sure I used Debian for a while too. It's very stable. Never had it break, anything like that. It's a great OS.
I've screwed it up. I have screwed it up before.
Oh, you have to screw up every Linux distro. That's just how it goes.
Right.
But that's all I had to say for this interview. So if you have any last comments, this is, I guess, the time to speak. But that's all I really have on my end for you.
Cool. So thank you very much. This is great. And, for your audience, check out the stuff we're doing at PrivacySafe.tech. It will grow and enlarge and be awesome, but in the beginning, we need your support as well. So if you want to check out some cool stuff, if you don't mind hearing me speak, especially, the first few classes we'll be doing digital self-defense. So it should be pretty awesome.
That's great. No, thank you for all of your hard work. I absolutely love everything that Yale Privacy Labs and yourself post on Twitter, and yeah, it's just wonderful. Thank you all for your hard work and all your contributions you've had to the whole privacy community, and also I'm just grateful that I'm even in a position where I get to talk to someone like you. So it's just great to have this community. So I guess thanks to the community there as well, and I hope that the community takes a lot out of this interview, because this isn't just something that you get to hear every day. So thank you for all of your great words.
Yeah, you're very welcome. And I guess just one more thing quickly, since you brought it up. Yeah, Yale Privacy Lab, we're also doing very great work there. I don't want to, subsume that. You're going to see a lot more of us out of the fall. Things have been kind of, as everyone knows, the last couple of months have been a bit tumultuous. So some of the things we were doing were a little nipped in the bud. But we're actually working. So, I've got a call tomorrow where we're going to be working on this stuff, and we're going to work all summer. So what we were going to do in the spring is going to be that much better in the fall. So stay tuned for that as well.
I'm excited. That's all I have to say. So goodbye, community. Have a great day, and give a like below if you like this video, and make sure to subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next video.